Beyond GDP is the search for metrics that do a better job of measuring social progress than GDP. GDP is the way that we measure our economy, so the amount of goods and services that are produced by the market and by the government. But it's of course not a metric for well-being, it's not a metric for sustainability, and it's not a metric for equity in society. So Beyond GDP is the generic name for the search for alternatives. There's been a lot of progression in my thinking actually when I started as a 30-something at Statistics Netherlands to start to measure these kind of phenomenon. I really thought that what we were looking for was just a number to replace GDP. So we have this really powerful number in our society, in our media. So what we need is an alternative number. And I spent loads of time in my career actually looking for this alternative. And I think many people still view it as that's the end result that we're looking for. But as time has gone on, I really realized that there's a much larger issue, a much larger problem that we're trying to solve. And that is that, the narrative in society, what is the role of a person? What is the role of a company? What is the role of a government? What are the goals actually of all these actors in society? That narrative is what we're really trying to change, and metrics are a component of that change, but they're not the end goal that we're looking for. Some are more successful than others, and I think that's what's so fascinating about economics, is that basically after the Second World War, they became the storytellers of our society. And I like to think of how did they do that? How did they actually manage to capture the storyline of society? And what can we learn from that is really the goal of my research. The first aspect of the narrative is that economics is important. So just the main fact that economics is mentioned so often actually focuses our attention on the economy. But there's a society, there's an environment, so we're constantly focusing on economics. The second aspect is growth is good. So the direction of the economy should be towards growth. And I think that's a very constant aspect of the coverage of economics. And the third aspect, I think, is also that our roles in society are increasingly discussed in economic terms. So as a citizen, I'm a voter, I'm a volunteer, I'm a neighbor, but I'm also a consumer, an investor, or a worker. And I think actually the narrative also tends to focus attention on the economic roles that we play, rather than things like volunteering or neighborly behavior. That's the core question. How did economists capture the storyline of society? And I sometimes liken it to Harry Potter. J.K. Rowling actually wrote Harry Potter, and it's a great narrative. But actually 12 publishing houses rejected that book. So she had a great narrative, but she couldn't get it published. She couldn't get a megaphone for her narrative. The Great Depression of the early 30s and the Second World War were crucial in getting the narrative out there. Economists had a narrative and they were fairly successful, but really this projected them to superstardom, those crises. And I think their story worked perfectly for that time. I mean, the world was in tatters and we needed to grow economically. And, people were hungering for a story of how to avoid unemployment, how to recover from the war. So that story worked perfectly. And they managed to find a megaphone, a publisher, basically for their storyline. And building on that, what they've done brilliantly is actually capture the institutions. So make sure also that the narrative became institutionalized. So even now, that narrative, I think, is no longer actually relevant to our society because it's become so institutionalized. that storyline, it's very difficult to replace. In my view, actually, for the last decades or so, we've had loads of alternative narratives, and they are very consistent. They basically say there's more to life than money. We need to live within the limits that nature sets us, and to live in a just society, we need to pay attention to inequality. Those are three core aspects of narratives which have been told for 50 years, but perhaps even centuries. So actually, I think we have the narratives. What we don't have is the megaphone. We haven't been published. If we look at the alternative narratives from the lens of those 4 success factors, I think it also becomes clear why we haven't had the megaphone yet. The first aspect is harmonization of language. If you look at economists, they are remarkably harmonized in the terminology that they use. So GDP is known to all macroeconomists, to all economists all around the world. Consumption, investments, imports, exports, all those kind of things are known. And if you look at other sciences, there's a lot of different terminology going around. Well-being, sustainable development, green growth, degrowth, sustainability, circular economy, loads of terms which are sometimes synonymous, sometimes not. And quite often when we meet each other, we'll have to first have the first quarter of an hour, we'll have to discuss, well, what exactly do you mean by well-being? What do you mean by sustainability? And then afterwards, we'll have a great conversation. But economists don't need that quarter of an hour of coordination. Second aspect, statistics. There are loads of statistics, but because this language is so different, you'll have the Human Development Index there, you'll have Sustainable Development Goal statistics there, gender and progress indicators. There's many different indicators all over the world, and data is being collected. So there's not a problem in terms of the amount of statistics, but the coherence, I think, is a big problem, and also a speed of statistics. GDP figures are published in 200 countries, and in many countries it's done every quarter and a month after each quarter. So very fast and abundant statistics. The third aspect is modeling. Economists cannot just tell you what happened yesterday and in the quarter before, but they can actually give you advice about the future. If a policymaker comes up to them and says, well, what can I do about the economic slowdown? The economists will say, well, look at productivity, or try and stimulate consumption, or stimulate investment. And they do that based on models about the future of the economy. So modeling is well organized in economics. Now, there are models for biodiversity, climate change. I do think we have a core set of models. But really models which look at well-being, sustainability, and equity in a coherent fashion, we haven't yet developed. And the final point, I think, is really the crucial one, and that is institutionalization. In education, in media, in government, in science, in companies, everywhere there is a prevalence of economic thinking. You know, there are many international institutes which have a Beyond GDP program, so there's a certain amount of institutionalization. But on all 4 aspects, I think we are really lagging behind the economic narrative. And I think we need to professionalize and see that this is the reason that we're not getting a megaphone. Act more like a community. So really see that we're part of the same community, projecting this one narrative, which I think we all do in a slightly different way, but basically is all the same. And we need to, for example, coordinate our terminology. Because if we are using all different terms and we're confused by the terms ourselves, how confusing is that to society? Coordinate our statistics. If we have dozens of indicator sets for Beyond GDP, and everybody's publishing them at different times, can journalists really understand all these different indicators? So why don't we work together towards terminology and statistics, and also work towards modeling? What is our story about the future? What will people's lives look like in the future? Can we work towards some kind of modeling where well-being, sustainability, and equity are part of the modeling future? And let's also be very power-oriented. How are we going to institutionalize these statistics, these models, and this terminology? How are we going to get those in the international institutes, in the governments, in science, in education? I think that's also a core aspect. We need to think more in terms of power structures than rather rewriting the narrative over and over again. Before the war, countries would measure their economy in different ways. So the Netherlands, America, the UK, Canada, they all measured the economy in their own ways. So there was also a very heterogeneous set of terms that they used and also statistics. After the war, in the build-up of Europe and the world really, the United Nations really stepped in and said, well, listen, we need to know what an economy is based on a harmonized understanding of what the economy is. So they set a guideline, a handbook on an accounting system, which endures to this very day. And I think that, that coordinating mechanism, that leadership is sometimes lacking in our community. I think society is screaming for our story. They want to hear it. People realize all these things, and just like the economists capitalized on the moment during the Great Depression and the Second World War and the aftermath, we need to capitalize on this moment to tell our story. And I think with this, we don't need a single strategy. We need to influence government, we need to influence the streets, we need to influence business. But in each case, the change maker needs to think about, how can I bring this slightly forward in the domain that I'm working on. If you're a change maker citizen, then there's a different story. If you're a change maker policy maker, it's different. If you're a change maker statistical person, then there's a different story. So I do think you need to really, change maker sounds very generic, but I think you really need a focused strategy of what each change maker can contribute. So we need to shift away from economic growth as a goal of society, and we need to be very focused on what the real goals are. So well-being, sustainability, and equity. And that's why we coined the term WISE, well-being, sustainability, and equity. And that's also the foundation of the work that we'll be doing at the United Nations, is to really focus on those three goals and to institutionalize and create the megaphone for those terms. I think we should have that at the government level, so that those are the goals that governments are led by. We should have it at the corporate level, so that companies are actually looking at their own role in the world from this WISE perspective. And also at the individual level, I think it also resonates, these goals really in your life, that you think of, how do I lead a good life, but how can I do it in a way that's equitable and sustainable? So actually I think this concept really translates to all dimensions and all institutions within our society. So I hope I've convinced you that well-being, sustainability, and equity, WISE, are the core goals of society, and that they actually resonate at various levels. They resonate at the government level, at the company level, and even at the personal level. So I'm really curious, can you actually judge how your organization or how your personal life or how your government would score on WISE metrics? And how could you actually change that? What can you do to actually create this megaphone that we're looking for?